When the door finally broke open, she was still holding her daughter. No one spoke at first. Not the men who forced their way inside. Not the neighbors who had followed behind. Not even the officer who stepped in last, already expecting trouble. Because whatever they had prepared themselves to see, it wasn't this. She was sitting on the floor, back against the far wall, arms wrapped around the small body in her lap. Still. Too still. Her head tilted slightly downward, as if she had simply fallen asleep. But her hands were still wet. That's the part they never wrote down. The report would later say the scene was disturbing. Another version would call it tragic. One man would insist it was sudden, uncontrollable. But none of them described what it actually felt like to stand in that room, to realize that something irreversible had already happened, long before anyone arrived. The cabin itself was small. One room, rough wood walls, poorly sealed against the cold. A single window, half frosted from the night air. The fire in the corner had burned low, barely holding on. There were signs of movement, of struggle, of urgency. A chair overturned, a blanket dragged across the floor. Footprints, half melted into muddy slush near the entrance. And then, the silence again. Heavy, pressing, unnatural. She didn't look up when they entered, didn't react to the noise, didn't acknowledge the men standing just a few feet away, as if whatever mattered had already passed. One of them stepped closer, carefully, not out of fear of her, but of what he might confirm. He crouched, reached out, hesitated, then touched the child's arm. Cold. That's when someone in the doorway whispered, "Jesus." But she still didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't defend herself, didn't explain. Because there was nothing left to explain. Outside, more people had gathered, drawn by the noise, by the shouting, by the kind of disturbance that travels faster than sound in a place like this. They didn't know what had happened yet, only that something had. Something serious enough to bring men running through snow in the middle of the night. The officer finally spoke. Not loudly, not with authority, but with the kind of voice someone uses when they're trying to understand something they don't want to understand. What happened here? For a moment, no one answered. Then, very slowly, she lifted her head. Her eyes moved across the room, not searching, not afraid, just steady, tired. They were coming. That was all she said, and somehow that made it worse. Because everyone in that room knew exactly what she meant. They didn't ask who, didn't ask why, didn't ask how close, because those answers were already understood. Men, dogs, chains. The kind of return that didn't leave anything of you behind. One of the men shifted uncomfortably. Another looked away. The officer remained still, watching her, watching the child, trying to piece together something that refused to make sense. until it did. Because if they were coming, and she knew they would take the child, and she knew what that meant, then this wasn't sudden. It wasn't madness. It wasn't loss of control. It was a decision. And that was the part no one in that room was ready to say out loud. It hadn't started in that cabin. By the time they broke down the door, everything that mattered had already happened, hours earlier. The night had been colder than usual, the kind of cold that doesn't just settle on your skin, but sinks deeper into your lungs, your bones, your thoughts. She had known they were coming before anyone said it out loud. You always know. Not from warnings, not from kindness, but from the silence. The way conversations stop when you enter a room. The way eyes don't meet yours. The way time suddenly feels shorter. By nightfall, she was already moving. No lantern, no fire, no sound she didn't control. Just the weight of 2 children and the knowledge that hesitation meant capture. The ground was already stiff with frost. Each step carried risk, each breath visible in the dark. The older child stayed close, silent, understanding more than they should. The younger one, too small to understand, only felt the cold. She moved fast at first, then slower, then faster again. Not because she was unsure, but because she was listening. There it was, far behind, but not far enough. They had already started. The plan had always been simple. Cross the river, reach the other side, keep moving. Because once you crossed, everything was supposed to change. But the river in winter doesn't care about plans. When she reached the edge, she stopped, just for a second, because what lay ahead was worse than what followed behind. The surface looked solid, white, unbroken, but ice lies, always. It holds until it doesn't. She didn't have time to test it, didn't have time to choose another path, because the sound behind her was getting louder, faster, closer. So she stepped onto the river. The first step held, then the second, then the third, each one quieter than the last, because now silence mattered more than speed. The ice responded to every movement, a whisper, a warning, a promise that it could give way at any moment. She shifted the child in her arms, adjusted her balance, moved slower, careful, precise, because one wrong step would end everything. Behind her, they had reached the river. You could hear it in the way the dogs changed, excited, focused, certain. They're on the ice. She didn't turn around, didn't look, because looking back makes you slow down, and slowing down means they catch you. The older child stumbled, just slightly, enough. She grabbed them immediately, pulled them forward. No words, no reassurance, just movement, because fear travels faster than sound. Halfway across, the river changed. The ice beneath her feet shifted. Not breaking, not yet, but moving. That's when she understood. It wasn't just fragile, it was already weakening. The cold had held it together, but the weight, hers, the children's, the men behind her, was too much. The river wasn't stable, it was waiting to decide who it would carry and who it would take. They were on the river now, close enough that she could hear their steps, close enough that there was no longer a distance to measure. The younger child began to cry, soft at first, then louder. She tried to quiet them, held them tighter, pressed them close, but fear doesn't listen. And neither do men who are hunting. There, ahead! The ice split, Not completely, but enough. A line, sharp and jagged, racing across the surface. She stopped, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Because one more step forward might break everything beneath her. And behind her, they were still coming. Faster now, confident, certain. That's when she realized something. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a quiet clarity that settled in her chest. She wasn't going to outrun them. Not with the ice breaking. Not with 2 children. Not with the distance already gone. The river had closed the path ahead, and the men behind had closed everything else. There was nowhere left to go. And in that moment, standing between the ice and the men, the choice began to form. There is a moment, right before everything changes, when the world becomes very quiet. Not because the danger is gone, but because your mind has finally caught up with it. She stood there, on a river that was beginning to break beneath her feet, with men closing in behind, and 2 children who could not outrun what was coming. The older one clung to her arm now, not asking questions, not crying, just holding on. Because children understand more than they're supposed to when fear is this close. She looked forward, the ice ahead, fractured, unstable, impossible. She looked back and saw exactly how little distance remained. That was when the truth settled in, not as panic, not as shock, but as something colder, clearer. There would be no escape. And once that becomes certain, the mind does something strange. It stops searching for a way out and starts searching for a way through. What happens next is not fast. It never is. Because decisions like this don't come from impulse. They come from everything that came before. Years of being owned, of being watched, of knowing that your life is not your own, of seeing what happens to children who grow up in that system. Sold, separated, erased. She had seen it, heard it, understood it, long before this night. And now, it wasn't a question of what might happen. It was a certainty. If they were taken, they would not come back the same. The younger one was crying harder now, cold, frightened, confused, too young to understand the danger, but old enough to feel it. She pulled the child closer, pressed their face into her shoulder, shielded them from the wind, from the sound, from the world that was closing in. The older child whispered something, too quiet to hear clearly, but the meaning didn't need words. She looked down at them, really looked, not as someone trying to escape, but as someone seeing them for the last time. Because that's when it became real. Not the river, not the men, not the chase. The ending. The ice shifted again beneath her feet. A warning, a countdown. Behind her, they were almost there. Close enough to see, close enough to reach, close enough to take everything back. Stop! She didn't move. Not forward, not back. Because there was nowhere left that meant safety. Only choice. Coming in what she refused to let happen. She made it. Not out loud, not visibly, but completely. No hesitation, no second thought, no hope that something else might change the outcome. Because hope had already been taken from her long before that night. All that remained was control over one thing, one moment, one outcome. The younger child's crying softened as she held them closer, shielded them from the wind, from the cold, from everything approaching behind her. And for a brief second, the world felt still again. Not safe, not peaceful, but decided. Behind her, the men slowed. not because they understood, but because something in her stillness made them hesitate. They saw it too. Not what she was about to do, but that whatever it was could not be stopped. The river cracked again, louder this time, a line tearing through the space between them, separating, dividing. And in that space, between the breaking ice and the men who had come to claim them, the decision became irreversible. Because some choices are not about survival. They're about what you refuse to survive. For a brief moment, everything went silent. Not because the danger had passed, but because nothing else needed to be decided. The river beneath her feet, still shifting. The men behind her, still there. The cold, still cutting through everything. But inside that moment, none of it mattered anymore. Because the choice had already been made. She lowered herself slowly to her knees, not out of weakness, but with intention. Careful, controlled, as if the world might break apart with any sudden movement. The older child stayed close, still holding onto her arm, not understanding, but refusing to let go. The younger one, quiet now, pressed against her, shielded from the wind, from the noise, from what was coming. Behind her, the men had stopped. Not out of mercy, not out of hesitation, but because something in that moment felt wrong to interrupt. Even they could feel it. She didn't look back, didn't acknowledge them, because they were no longer part of the decision. She focused only on what was in front of her, in her arms, close enough to feel every breath, every movement, every fragile second that still belonged to her. Her hands moved slowly, not rushed, not frantic, but deliberate, as if she was trying to memorize something before it disappeared. The older child whispered again, this time clearer, a question, one she didn't answer, because there are questions that have no answers that make sense. Instead, she pulled them closer, both of them, for the last time. And for a brief second, it looked like nothing was wrong, like a mother holding her children against the cold, against the night, against the world. Then, the moment passed. Not loudly, not violently, not in a way the river would remember, but in a way that every person standing there would carry with them for the rest of their lives. No one moved, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to interrupt, nothing left to stop. The river continued to shift beneath them, unconcerned, indifferent, as if what had just happened was too small or too human to matter. Behind her, one of the men took a step forward, then stopped. Not because he was afraid, but because something in that space felt final. She remained still, not looking up, not reacting, not resisting, because whatever strength had carried her across the river had already been spent. What remained was quiet, heavy, unmovable. The older child, no longer holding as tightly. The movement in her arms, gone, replaced by stillness. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not in the river, not in the air, but in the understanding of everyone who had witnessed it. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't panic. This wasn't loss of control. It was the opposite. It was control, taken back, in the only way she had left. No one tried to stop her, because by the time they understood, there was nothing left to stop. And the river kept moving, as if it had seen this before, as if it would see it again, as if it would never tell. By morning, they had already decided what it would be called. Not what it was, not what happened, but what it would be written as. Because what happened on that river could not exist the way it truly was. So they gave it a name: tragedy. Another man called it madness. One report described it as an unfortunate loss of control. Words that soften, words that distance, words that make something unbearable, easier to file away. The courtroom filled quickly, not with people looking for truth, but with people looking for an explanation they could live with. She sat at the front, still, quiet. No resistance, no defense. No attempt to reshape what had already been decided. Because unlike everyone else in that room, she wasn't confused. She wasn't searching for a version of events that felt better. She already knew exactly what had happened. Witnesses spoke, one after another, each telling a slightly different story, each removing something or adding something until the moment itself became unrecognizable. Some said she panicked. Some said she lost her mind. Some insisted it happened too quickly to understand. But none of them said the one thing that mattered: that she had time, that she understood, that she chose. Because if they admitted that, then the question changed. It was no longer, what did she do? It became, why would anyone be forced to make that choice? And that question was far more dangerous. Because it didn't point at her. It pointed at everything around her. The system, the law, the certainty that if she had been taken back, her children would not belong to her, would not grow up free, would not even remain together. They would be divided, sold, erased. That was the future waiting on the other side of that river. Not possibility, not fear, certainty. And that was the part the courtroom refused to hold. So they changed the story. Not completely, just enough. Just enough to make it acceptable. Just enough to make it distant. Just enough to move the responsibility away from themselves. In the official record, it became an incident, an event, a moment of instability, something that could be written down and closed. But the people who stood on that river, the ones who heard the ice crack, who saw her standing there, who understood what was coming, they carried something different. Not a story, a memory. Because memory doesn't soften things. It doesn't rearrange details. It doesn't protect anyone. It remembers exactly what happened. A woman standing between two endings, one chosen, one forced. And choosing the one that no one else would ever have to live through. The records remain, filed, archived, referenced, studied. But even now, they don't say everything. They never will. Because some truths don't fit into language designed to contain them. They exist somewhere else, in places like that river, in the silence that follows a decision no one should have to make, in the understanding that sometimes survival isn't the point. Control is. And long after the courtroom emptied, long after the papers were signed, long after the names were recorded and forgotten, the river kept moving, unchanged, uninterested, but remembering. It always remembers.